How can developers maximize the immersion of their games? In the early years, mostly due to technical limitations, the best way to create an engaging experience was through an enjoyable gameplay loop. The focus was on polishing the core mechanics so that the challenge and the fun of the gameplay kept players engaged. Most importantly, the goal was to make players come back, insert a coin, and play again day after day. One innovative idea and gameplay mechanic could carry an entire game. This principle still can be caught in today's indie scene. Another potential path to create immersion was through visuals, and it still plays a role today. We all know games that objectively speaking weren't great, but we loved them because they looked better than anything else at the time. But how could this be elevated any further? The human mind, especially the target audience of the time, is particularly sensitive to competitive challenges. We want to prove that we are better than others. Are you a good player? Prove it. Someone beat your score? Come back tomorrow, check the leaderboard and fight to the top again. As home consoles and PCs grew more powerful, the focus of game design could also shift. Games now offered experiences that weren't just short adventures between coin drops, but rather continuous stories that player could dive into. However, as such a young medium, video games needed time to develop their own narrative language. Designers frequently adapted storytelling techniques from other mediums like tabletop RPGs or the narrative mechanics of fighting fantasy books. Manuals and booklets of the games were also excellent tools to provide background on the game's world. Later on, cinematic techniques such as cutscenes emerged. These were short animations embedded in the game's narrative that could propel the story forward, providing a movie-like experience. When it comes to FPS storytelling and its unique language, the game Half-Life from 1998 became a true cornerstone. But how did Valve's team manage to create a game that remains memorable to this day? Why do generations of developers cite it as a source of inspiration? Everything was dedicated to immersion. At the time, FPS games typically threw players straight into the action. However, Half-Life starts with a 5-minute train ride. The underground monorail takes players through various sections of the Black Mesa research facility, showcasing a living, breathing world. During the ride, you listen to an automated message not addressed to you, the player, but to a scientist on his way to work.
If you feel you have been exposed to radioactive or other hazardous materials in the course of your duties, contact your radiation safety officer immediately.
They use several excellent tricks to help players fully immerse themselves in the game world. While not a new concept, Gordon Freeman's silence is a key part of the immersion. This design decision deepens the player's connection to the character. Every dialogue is fake. All the scientists, guards, or even G-Men speaks to you without requiring direct response, leaving your actions to speak for you.
If you're interested, just step into the portal and I will take that as a yes.
In typical other games, every mission is a different map. But in Half-Life, the entire Black Mesa is a cohesive complex, where different sections may vary in design, but form a unified whole. There are no loading screens between levels, transition happens as you move through corridors, maintaining the sense of being part of a unified world. There are no gameplay interrupting cutscenes. The whole story is told through the environment, scripted events, and the actions of the lab personnel. Every major event, every twist unfolds before our eyes. We are active participants in the disaster at Black Mesa. This posed a significant challenge for the developers. While in a movie the camera focuses on key events, in a 3D game the player can look anywhere. The challenge was to gently direct the player's attention so they wouldn't miss important moments. A typical method is to lead the player's gaze through a door or corridor, naturally guiding their sight to the next significant event. For example, when the government has sent soldiers to resolve the disaster, by the actions of a few naive scientists you discover that these forces weren't sent for rescue. Another excellent example of the lab being a living, breathing environment is the scene where you acquire the Tau cannon.
What is this thing? Is it some kind of weapon?
Put that down. It's a prototype.
Man, why aren't we using it?
It's much too unpredictable. Don't let it overcharge.
What do you mean, overcharge?
That's why I chose this weapon for my next project. It symbolizes brilliantly why Half-Life remains an iconic piece of gaming history. But I probably talked too much already. I don't want to bore you any further.
Gordon doesn't need to hear all this. He's a highly trained professional.
Let's get to it. The first step was designing the model. This concept was trickier than my previous projects because it includes a rotating illuminated element in the center. Thankfully, I built up some experience in designing weapon replicas, so I was confident this project wouldn't result as many unnecessary prints as before. And it almost went that way. After sketching the basic frame and calculating the final size, I focused on the rotating section. The main challenge was that it should not only rotate, but also light up internally. After a few different designs, I came up with this solution. The wires for the lighting run through the inside of a bearing on one side, while the motor is placed on the other. This isn't the best possible way, but at the end of the day this is just a prototype, right? The original design clearly shows that it was made by a team of physicists, not a firearm engineer. I designed this model with a new strategy. I made a minimalist base frame and create all the decorative elements separately. This would speed up the post-processing and painting. I was a bit worried that the frame might end up being too weak, so I created a reinforced version. However, this deviated so much from the original design that I decided to scrap it. Once the model was completed and everything got its base coat, it was time for the assembly. I inserted the bearing into the rotating component, routed the cables and installed the LED. Then I crafted the small plexiglass panels that would effectively light up. Of course, I couldn't resist doing a quick test with the rotating element before finalizing the assembly. Unlike my previous flag cannon project, this weapon wasn't going to have a heavily worn look. Instead, I went for a subtle shading to increase the contrast. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. I've got plenty more fan favorites coming up. My next few projects are based on your comments. Speaking of which, let me know in the comments what replicas you'd love to see me create next. Before I use the metal color for chipping, I applied a layer that matches the base color but it's slightly lighter. It adds an extra dimension to the wear and tear and looks somewhat more believable. After completing the most important painting tasks, it was time to finalize the moving parts and wire up everything possible. I created several grooves on the side of the frame where the cables can visibly routed, further emphasizing the prototype look. Once the last few major components were in place, it was time to focus on the finer details. I fitted the plexiglass panels in their places, attached the tube connecting the front copper block to the frame, finished the gas canisters and their decals, which I also mounted onto the frame. After that, I positioned a few circuit boards and added more decals, gradually finalizing the weapon's appearance. At this point, I could finally cut and solder the last cables, completing the not too complicated electronics. When every piece was finally in place, it was time for another round of painting. A bit of extra wear and grime was added to make these parts blend into the overall look. Oh, and one more thing. Don't let it overcharge. If you would like to support my work, you can buy me a coffee or join my Patreon, where I share extra content about the designing and the completion of my projects.